The cab dropped me off at the curb just after 7 in the morning, and I stood there for a moment with my suitcase on the sidewalk, just looking at the house. 7 years. That's how long I'd been gone. 7 years working construction project management in Abu Dhabi. Sending money home every month, telling myself it was temporary, telling myself one more contract, one more year, until the years stacked up like bricks. And suddenly my granddaughter was old enough to start school, and I'd missed all of it. The house was the one I'd bought for my daughter before I left. A 3-bedroom colonial on Pemberton Street in Clarksville, Tennessee. Good neighbourhood, solid bones, the kind of place I'd always wanted to give her. I signed it over to her outright. No mortgage, her name on the deed. I wanted her to have something real, something no one could take away. I had her key on my keyring. She didn't know I was coming. I'd planned it as a surprise. Finished my final contract 2 weeks early, booked the first flight home I could find. I was going to knock on that door and watch her face when she saw me standing there. But as I rolled my suitcase up the front walk, I heard something through the open kitchen window that stopped me cold. A man's voice, sharp and flat, the way some men get when they want you to know they're in charge, without actually raising their hand yet. "You missed a spot." The whole left side of the stove. "Do it again." I didn't move. I stood on that front walk, suitcase handle in my fist, and I listened. Then I heard my daughter's voice. Quiet. "Careful. I'll get it." That was all she said. "I'll get it." Not "yes, honey," or "sorry, I was rushing." Just that flat, defeated little phrase. I'd raised that girl to have a backbone. I'd watched her argue with her high school principal and win. The voice I heard through that window didn't belong to the woman I knew. I used my key. The front door opened into the living room, and what I saw in those first few seconds is something I have to stop and take a breath before I describe even now. My daughter was on her hands and knees in front of the stove. She was wearing a grey t-shirt that was 2 sizes too big and a pair of sweatpants with a bleach stain on the knee. Her hair was pulled back in a loose, unwashed bun. There were marks on her forearms, not fresh but visible, the pale yellow-green of bruises that were a week or 2 old. She hadn't seen me yet. She was scrubbing. Standing at the kitchen table with a coffee mug was a man I recognised from the single video call I'd managed with my daughter, about 2 years into my time overseas. Her husband. He was younger than her by a few years, good-looking in that overly groomed way, the kind of man who spent more time on his appearance than his character. He was scrolling through his phone. He didn't look up when the door opened. "Close it behind you," he said, assuming it was a delivery. I closed it. He looked up. My daughter turned around. The sound she made, it wasn't a word. It was the sound a person makes when something has been squeezing their chest for a very long time, and suddenly the pressure shifts just enough to let a little air back in. She got to her feet so fast she almost slipped on the wet floor, and then she was across the kitchen, and her arms were around me, and she was shaking. I held her. I could feel her shoulder blades through her shirt. She'd lost weight she didn't have to lose. Her husband set his mug down on the table, slow, deliberate, and looked at me the way a man looks at something that's complicated his plans. "You must be the father," he said. "Lowell didn't mention you were coming." "Lowell is my name." My daughter pulled back and wiped her face with the back of her hand. She wouldn't quite meet my eyes. "Dad, this is Trent." "Trent," he said it himself a second later. "Trent Bascom." He didn't offer his hand. I nodded once. "I can see you've made yourself comfortable in my daughter's house." "Our house," he said, smiling. "We're married." I looked around the kitchen while he said it. The coffee maker on the counter was a brand new model, the kind that cost $300. The refrigerator had been replaced. Bigger, newer stainless. But the walls hadn't been painted in years. The linoleum near the sink was cracked and lifting at one corner, and on the hook beside the back door hung an apron. White canvas. Block letters ironed across the front. "Bascom family, house kipper." I read it twice. My daughter saw me read it. The colour came into her face and then drained back out just as fast. "I'd like to talk to my daughter," I said. "Alone." Trent made a small sound, something between a laugh and a sigh, and pushed back from the table. "Knock yourself out," he said, and walked down the hall toward the back bedroom without another word. When I heard the door close, I turned to my daughter and I said, "Sit down. Tell me everything." She told me. It took a long time. She stopped several times and had to start over. Not because she was confused, but because she'd spent years not saying any of it out loud, and the shape of it was hard to get out all at once. It had started before they were married, but only barely. Trent had swept in fast. They'd met at her office. He'd been charming and attentive and told her she was the most capable woman he'd ever met. They got engaged after 8 months. I wasn't home for the wedding. I sent money for the reception and a card that said the wrong things and a phone call that got cut short because of a time zone issue I handled badly. The wedding was the last time any of her friends from before were ever made to feel welcome in her life. He didn't do it all at once. That's what she kept trying to explain to me. And I could hear how important it was to her that I understand this, that she wasn't stupid, that she hadn't missed obvious warning signs. He was like a man who turns down a thermostat 1 degree at a time. So slow you don't notice the cold until you're already shivering and can't remember when the warmth stopped. He stopped driving her to her own appointments. Small thing. He suggested she not go back to work after her maternity leave. Sensible thing, he said with a baby. He started making comments about her mother, my late wife, God rest her, about the way I'd raised her, about how some women were taught to be selfish without realizing it. Every time she pushed back, there was a cost. Not always physical, just the temperature in the room dropping, just the silence at dinner that lasted 2 hours instead of 30 minutes. She'd had a hard pregnancy. Bad enough that her OB referred her to a psychiatrist by the 6th month. Postpartum, the depression had gotten severe. She had a prescription, 2 of them. The psychiatrist's notes, which I would read later that week, described her at her worst as disoriented, highly suggestible, and unable to advocate effectively for herself. That's when Trent had brought his mother into the house. He told my daughter it was to help with the baby. What it was a witness, a reinforcement. His mother moved into the back bedroom and was there for every conversation, every decision, every quiet moment when my daughter might have had the space to think clearly. When my daughter had a good week and started talking about going back to work part-time, his mother was the one who said, gently, that my daughter really wasn't well enough, that she'd seen it herself, that Trent was carrying so much already. I need to stop here and tell you something about my daughter. She was 34 years old. She had a college degree in accounting. She had managed a team of 11 people. The woman who had raised her, her mother, my wife, worked double shifts as a hospital administrator for 15 years and never once let any of us forget that we were capable of more than we thought. The person sitting across from me at that kitchen table had all of that in her. It was still there, but it had been buried under 3 years of being told in 100 different ways that she couldn't trust herself. That was the version of her that Trent had gotten to sign the papers. What papers? I said. She got up and went to the hall closet. She came back with a manila folder. I spread the pages on the kitchen table. I'm not a lawyer, but I spent 30 years in project management, which means I spent 30 years reading contracts. What I was looking at was a quitclaim deed, dated 18 months ago, in which my daughter had transferred her interest in this property to Trent's LLC, a company called Bascom Property Solutions, registered in Tennessee. There was also a household services agreement, which was just what it sounded like. A document that described my daughter's domestic responsibilities in clinical, itemized detail, including a clause that specified she was not to invite guests or family members to the property without prior written consent from the managing partner. That's what the apron was about. That's what Bascom family housekeeper meant. It wasn't a joke. Did you have a lawyer look at this? I asked. She shook her head. He said it was just for tax purposes. He said the LLC protected the house. Did you sign it voluntarily? She looked at me for a long time. I don't remember signing it, she said finally. I remember him explaining it. I remember thinking it sounded complicated. And then it was done. I folded the documents back into the folder. I told her I was going to make some phone calls. I told her not to say anything to Trent about our conversation. I told her she had done nothing wrong. I said that last part twice because I could see from her face that she needed to hear it twice. She nodded and went back to the stove. I took the folder to my rental car and drove to a coffee shop 6 blocks away and started making calls. The first call was to a family law attorney named Gwen Hutchins, whose number I got from the Tennessee Bar's referral line. She took 20 minutes with me over the phone and then said she needed to see the documents in person, but that what I was describing sounded like undue influence and potentially fraudulent conveyance. She told me to document everything I could. The second call was to my daughter's OB's office. I identified myself as her father and told them I was concerned about her welfare. The nurse was appropriately cautious, but gave me enough to know that my daughter had missed her last 4 appointments. The third call was to the psychiatrist listed on the prescription bottles I'd photographed with my phone while I was alone in the kitchen for 30 seconds. Her office was closed, but the voicemail told me her name, Dr. Yvonne Talbot. I left a detailed message. That afternoon, I drove back to the house and acted like nothing had happened. I helped my daughter's little girl, my granddaughter, who had my late wife's eyes and a laugh that sounded like a small alarm going off. I helped her build a block tower in the living room floor. Her name was Dot, short for Dorothy. She was 3 years old and she called me Pop Pop without being told to, which was the most purely good thing that had happened to me in 7 years. Trent watched from the couch, not warmly. That night I told him I'd be staying for a few weeks. He said pleasantly. That was fine, that the guest room was available. The way he said it let me know that I was a guest, implying this was his house to offer, not my daughter's house, where she was already a stranger in her own rooms. I said, "That's generous of you considering I bought it." He smiled and went to bed. Over the next 5 days I built a file. Dr. Talbot returned my call on day 2. She couldn't discuss my daughter's case directly. HIPAA, she explained, which I already knew. But she agreed to meet with my daughter if my daughter was willing, and she listened for a long time while I described what I'd observed. When I was done, she said carefully, "Mr. Prentice, I'd encourage your daughter to come in. There are circumstances under which a patient's ability to provide informed consent to legal documents can be compromised by certain combinations of medications and psychological state. That's all I can say to you." She said it very clearly. She said it twice. That was enough. The attorney Gwen Hutchins had a colleague who specialised in elder law and financial exploitation of vulnerable adults. His name was Paul Driscoll, and he was the kind of lawyer who didn't waste words. He looked at the quitclaim deed and the household services agreement and said this was prepared by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He also said that the LLC had been registered 4 days after my daughter's psychiatrist had increased her medication to its maximum dosage, a fact he extracted from the public record of the prescription and cross-referenced with the LLC's state registration date, 4 days. Trent had waited until my daughter was at her most medicated and most disoriented, and then he had put papers in front of her. Paul filed for an emergency hearing to contest the deed transfer. He also contacted the district attorney's office because what Trent had done met the threshold for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, which under Tennessee law doesn't require the victim to be elderly. It requires the victim to have a diminished capacity. My daughter's medical records established that clearly. Trent found out about the filing on a Thursday. I was in the kitchen with my granddaughter when I heard him on the phone in the hallway, his voice low and controlled in that way people get when they are frightened, and trying not to show it. His mother drove over that night. I heard them in the back bedroom for 2 hours. The next morning, Trent was calm. Too calm. He came to breakfast and talked about the weather and asked my granddaughter what she wanted to do on Saturday, and the whole time his eyes kept moving to me and then away. That evening I went out to get groceries. I was gone 40 minutes. When I came back, I smelled smoke before I turned the corner. It wasn't the house. It was the detached garage at the back of the property. The one where my daughter kept boxes of documents, childhood photos, her college diplomas, and apparently a fireproof lockbox that she had told me about on day 3 of my visit. The lockbox contained paper copies of the original deed from when I'd transferred the house to her, along with printed bank statements from the account Trent had moved her out of. The garage was fully involved by the time the fire department arrived. The lockbox was recovered, intact. Fireproof boxes work, but the rest was gone. Trent, when the fire marshal asked him where he'd been, said he'd been inside the house the entire evening. I had a Ring doorbell camera installed on day 2 of my stay. I hadn't mentioned it to Trent. The footage showed him walking to the garage at 6:47 p.m. with a red plastic gasoline container. It showed him walking back without it at 6:53. I handed the fire marshal my phone. He watched the footage twice. Then he excused himself to make a call. Trent was arrested that night. He was charged with arson and with tampering with evidence related to an ongoing civil proceeding, which, Paul explained, elevated the financial exploitation charge significantly. His mother was questioned but not charged. She left the property that night and did not come back. My daughter called me from the living room when they put him in the patrol car. She didn't say anything. She just stood at the window with Dot on her hip and watched. Then she looked at me and said, "Is it over?" I said, "The worst of it is." The civil hearing came 6 weeks later. Paul presented the timeline, the LLC registration date, the medication records, Dr. Talbot's testimony about my daughter's diminished capacity at the time of signing, and the quitclaim deed itself. The judge voided the deed. The household services agreement was declared unenforceable. The house went back into my daughter's name, free and clear, exactly as it had been the day I signed it over to her. Trent pled guilty to the arson charge to avoid trial on the others. He was sentenced to 4 years. His attorney managed to get 2 of those years suspended, so he served 26 months, which I will never think was enough. But Paul told me to focus on what had been restored, not on what the system couldn't give us back, and he was right. The lockbox, as it turned out, was the least of what we recovered. My daughter, in one of her clearer weeks 2 years earlier, had made digital copies of most of the key documents and emailed them to an account she'd created that Trent didn't know about. She'd buried the thought, she told me, because she hadn't trusted herself enough at the time to act on it. But some part of her had known. I told her that was the woman I raised. She cried when I said it. I let her. We used the court-ordered restitution from the arson conviction to repair the garage and repaint the house exterior. My daughter went back to see Dr. Talbot and began adjusting her medications properly, with a treatment team that she chose herself. By spring, she was running 3 miles on weekday mornings. I know because sometimes I went with her. I stayed 9 months, longer than I'd planned. I told myself it was practical. There was repair work to supervise, legal follow-up, paperwork. But the truth was I just wasn't ready to go back to anything that wasn't this. Dot turning 4. My daughter cooking a real dinner on a Sunday for the first time in years and standing in the kitchen, laughing at something on the radio, relaxed in her own home the way a person is supposed to be relaxed. I think about all the Sundays I've missed. 7 years of them. I can't get those back. That's not something I let myself spend too much time on, because it leads to a kind of thinking that doesn't do anyone any good. But I hold it. And I let it remind me what a long absence costs, and what showing up can still fix. I'm back in Clarksville now, permanently. I rent a place 12 minutes from Pemberton Street. I have a key to my daughter's house, the same key I never should have had to use the way I used it that first morning. And I use it the right way now, which is to say I knock first, and Dot opens the door and pulls me in by the hand to show me whatever she's decided matters most that day. Last week it was a caterpillar she'd found on the back porch. We spent 40 minutes looking at it. I told her the caterpillar was going to change into something completely different. She asked me if it was scared. I said I thought it probably wasn't. I said some changes, even the big ones, are what you were always supposed to become. She thought about that for a second and then asked me if we could have popsicles. We had popsicles.